Hey, good morning. Sławomir Rabowitz was a young Polish cavalry officer in 1939, and his crime was being Polish. That was his crime. Stalin and Stalin's aspirations for Eastern Europe pitted Poland directly against Russia, and Stalin began this deadly purge of removing anybody who had any leadership or any official position in the military. So in 1939 he was arrested, and after a brutal and torturous interrogation he was sentenced to 25 years in a gulag. He was chained and shackled and put on a transport truck that was heading east, just continually east. In fact, it went east for 3 months. It traveled until it arrived in rural, desolate Siberia. Gulag Camp 303, just 600 miles south of the Arctic Circle. A place so harsh and so cold, a place of such human deprivation that the few people who went in there ever left. 25 years in Gulag 303 really was a death sentence for being Polish. Well, it didn't take him long to be in there and experience the suffering that came with that place, that he knew he had to get out. He knew he had to break free. He knew his story couldn't end here. And so he did. With 6 others, on a stormy blizzard night, he broke out of the prison camp where the snow was coming down so heavy and the wind was blowing so hard that it covered their tracks. And he was able to start heading south. At least he thought he was heading south, but he, of course, went right into the smack of desolate, inhospitable Siberia. And that began his trek, his journey of over 6,500 kilometers to the promised land of British-controlled India. So if you know your geography, you know Russia and Siberia. At the very top of Russia, he went through Siberia, through Mongolia, across the Gobi Desert. He crossed the Himalayan mountains to the other side, to where he finally found freedom. Now, this whole story was immortalized in the book, The Long Walk, the true story of the trek to freedom. And I loved this book because it has history and because it has drama and because it has suffering and life and death struggles. But I loved this story because it touched, in some ways, it touches on some realities in our own life. That you and I are on a journey, and on our journey we experience sufferings, and the path to freedom is often a long one. In this story, he wasn't free when he broke out of the prison walls. He wasn't free when he broke out of the tundra in Siberia. He wasn't free yet when he crossed the border of Russia. It was a long journey to freedom. And in a way, that story reminds me of another true story about another long trek to freedom, and that's the book of Exodus. The story of Exodus is the story of God drawing his people out to draw them in, as you heard in the video. That's a Matt Chandler tagline, and it's a good one. It describes Exodus really well, and we'll use that repeatedly. God draws his people out. He draws them out of their bondage into his freedom, draws them out of their suffering into his comfort, out of their idolatry into his worship. He draws them out of Egypt into his promised land. God draws his people out to draw them in. And while you might be thinking Exodus is just some historical book from a long time ago, it is a historical book, but it's more than a historical book, because Exodus is our story as well. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Exodus is our story because Exodus amazingly foreshadows what God is going to do in Jesus for us. What God is going to do to rescue and lead us out. What God is going to do to draw us in Jesus. And so the whole story points forward to Jesus. But secondly, Exodus is our story because people are people. And people do what people do. And for all of our differences, when it get right down to it, our brokenness and our struggles and our pain and our mistakes, our foibles, we are more alike than we are different. It doesn't matter where you live. It doesn't matter when you live. People are people and will respond the way people respond. And so we're going to look at not just their journey to freedom, but I believe that through looking at their journey to freedom, God is going to speak to you about your journey to freedom. And so I played this video at the bumper at the start of the thing because we're not going to walk through the whole story of Exodus. We're going to take out 8 kind of narrative movements. 8 bits of the narrative that I think describe how God led them to freedom, but also describe how God leads us to freedom today. And so this series might even be a bit of a diagnosis for you to kind of see where you are at, and will help you choreograph what God might have as the next steps for you in your freedom. What God might be calling you out of, what He might be drawing you out of, and where He might be drawing you to. And so that's my prayer, that in this next 8 weeks, might you hear the voice of God drawing you out of your old life, maybe drawing you out of guilt or shame that you've carried for far too long, maybe drawing you out of addictions that you feel like you can't break from, maybe drawing you out of the inevitable misery and slavery that comes when we make anything in our life more important than God. Maybe He might even just draw you out of the resignation that some of us have, that this is as good as it gets. Might God draw you out in order to draw you in. So let's get going. Exodus chapter 1. You can open up Bible around you. If you got one of the Bibles in the front, it'll be close to the front. Probably the first 70 or so pages should get you to around Exodus. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah; Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, who did not know about Joseph, came to power in Egypt. "Look," he said to his people. This is where the propaganda starts, right here. "The Israelites have become much too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they made them build the cities of Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with hard labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their hard labor, the Egyptians used them ruthlessly. The book opens with the descendants of Jacob and Joseph in Egypt. Jacob and Joseph, who were once welcome, esteemed guests in Egypt, are now, their descendants are now exploited and enslaved by Pharaoh and the Egyptians. Now Joseph, their ancestor, was kind of a national hero to the Egyptians and to the Hebrews, because it was through his shrewd wisdom and his astute leadership that he spared the nation the worst effects of a crippling famine. But we're told that that's old news, that generations have passed. And the Hebrews have settled into Egypt and they're multiplying. And a new king comes to power, and like most dictators, this Pharaoh is insecure and he's paranoid. Despite his military, power that he has, his superiority, he is worried that if a foreigner comes and attacks their land, these, others in their own land might rise up and join them, and they got a war on two fronts. They're fighting, enemy from without and enemy from within. And so the sheer numbers of the Hebrews threatens to destabilize the land, and it stokes his fear. And so he unleashes his nationalist propaganda campaign against the Hebrews, and he stokes fear against them, and he begins to demonize them so that things can begin to change. And he comes up with a solution to deal with both his immigration problem and his labor problem. And he enslaves them and he puts them to work. His plan is this: they will brutalize the Hebrews by enslaving them to work on these massive, building projects. And so with their spirits crushed and their backs bent, right, in pain, they'll be unable to rebel, and instead all of their collective strength as a people will be used for the benefit of Egypt. While they get weaker, Egypt will get stronger. But as we read, that the more that they were enslaved, the more vicious they were. It was like an aphrodisiac for the Egyptians, and they just kept multiplying and putting out more babies. In fact, they increased in number, and this drives Pharaoh even more angry. His hatred of the Hebrews only grows and grows, and so he not only seeks to up the ante of how ruthless he will treat them, but we read he even does something else. That he unleashes this national campaign of infanticide. He wants all the Hebrew boys born destroyed. He wants them all murdered. Now, we might be familiar with the story, and we rip through the story because that's only a couple of verses. But it's always beneficial to pause and just try to emotionally anchor ourselves in what's going on in the narrative. Imagine the terror that grips a family when a decree like that goes out. Imagine the stress of being 8 months pregnant, 7 months pregnant, wondering what's about to happen. Imagine the feeling where life was good, and at one point you had hope for your kids, and you're building your little businesses, and your family is growing and thriving. You're doing well in Egypt, and all that to change in one sign of one decree, and now you're slaved. And there is, like, as far as you can see around you, it's suffering everywhere in every direction. And as far as you can look back to the history, it's just been suffering and suffering and suffering, because this has gone on for years now. And as far as your imagination can go forward, there is only suffering on the horizon. Life has taken a dramatic turn for the worse, and they're suffering. And if we just stop here, we can identify with them, even if our stories are different, because we can all identify with that word suffering. Right? We all know what it's like. And if you don't, it's only a matter of time, because suffering visits us all. Now, suffering breaks into our stories in different ways and to different degrees, but it visits us all. And the reason why it visits us all is because sin has given our world teeth. It's given our world teeth. And the world bites. And by the world, I mean you and me. We're the world. See, most of the suffering that you and I experience in our lives, most of it is the consequence of either our sinful choices or somebody else's sinful choice. We talked last week about greed, and Jesus talked last week about greed. But the reality is that when greed festers in a person's heart, when a person is driven for more and more, they'll find somebody by which they'll take more from them. For them to have more, somebody will go without. It's only a matter of time before somebody will be cheated, or somebody will be exploited, or somebody will be defrauded. That's the way it works. An unhinged mom with a temper that she feels like she can't control, that just explodes into heaps of verbal abuse on her kids, whose words actually begin to seep into their little souls and shape their lives, will put her children on a path to pain and suffering. A guy who thinks that pornography is just a private him and his computer thing, doesn't really hurt anybody, it's a victimless crime, will himself find it impossible for him to enjoy intimacy and be satisfied, and will find that he has plagued his wife with a feeling of insecurity, that she doesn't measure up, that she's not good enough, that she's not beautiful enough. Sin has given our world teeth, and it bites. And there is never a sin that doesn't have a consequence. And the culmination of those consequences is what causes most of the suffering in our lives. The hardest part of my job is sitting with people who are feeling the effects of sin, their own or somebody else's. And it's so heavy and it's so painful. And I sometimes leave meetings and are just so reminded how much of a mess sin makes. how much of a mess it's made in my story. It makes a mess. It always makes a mess. And so the story of Exodus begins in darkness. It begins in pain. It begins in suffering with the Hebrews enslaved. Why? Because the Egyptians have enslaved them. They are suffering because of the choices of somebody else. And the story starts, and for the first 2 chapters, there's barely any mention of God. In fact, the narrator kind of purposely doesn't even hardly reference to him. At least he doesn't appear to be doing anything. Pharaoh is the one making decrees. Pharaoh is the one calling the shots. Pharaoh is the one driving the story. We don't hear a peep from God. And so for 2 chapters, which covers years and years and years, things just get worse and worse and worse, and God seems absent. And while I'm speculating here, I think it's a fairly safe speculation that when the Egyptians rolled into town looking for baby boys, or to go haul off the dad, or to go and kill anybody who resisted, surely the people would have said, "Where is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Where are you? Why is God not acting? Why is injustice and brutality the theme of our story?" And here's where it's really easy for me to draw near to the story, because if you have some personal awareness in your own life of suffering, when things seem to conspire against you and there's no reprieve on the horizon, when things go from bad to worse in your life, we often ask the same question: God, where are you? Where are you in this? Will you not show yourself? Will you not show up? Now, in this story at least, we have the benefit of knowing what comes next. We have the benefit of being above the story. We have the benefit of being outside of their particular suffering. And so we can begin to see God's invisible hand at work. We can see that the promise that God made in Genesis 46 to multiply his people is coming true. We can see that God's sovereign hand thwarted Pharaoh's intention to exterminate the boys because of a few God-fearing midwives. We can see that God actually even uses that command to throw the boys in the river. He even takes that command, and that begins the initiation of the story by which Moses gets dropped in the river and finds himself right in Pharaoh's household and is raised up as the deliverer to come, as the redeemer to come, right under Pharaoh's nose. We see that and we know that. We see that the promise that God made to Abraham hundreds of years before was coming true when God said this: "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers." Remember that word. They were always meant to be strangers in a country not their own. They will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. God, in the story, in the first 2 chapters, seems absent. It seems like Pharaoh is calling the shots, but he isn't. Now, we can see that being outside of the story. It's really hard sometimes to see that in the midst of our own. It's really hard to see that when all we feel is pain. So you can imagine in real time, the Israelites are having a hard time seeing that. All they're seeing is whips and rods. Because the truth is, in the middle of pain, God's promises, God's presence often seems elusive and hard to see. Right? My first real encounter with this type of pain happened when my 19-year-old cousin named Waylon, guy I grew up with, we played in our first band together. I have a fairly big family, the Bardens, and some of my family members are just like crazy musical talented. Like, you remember my brother Dustin? So Waylon is like that. He was crazy musically talented. So we played in our first band together, and on a sunny Sunday afternoon, Labor Day weekend, he was heading back from the lake, And he came around a corner on a gravel road and he hit some washboard and it bounced his truck in the ditch and it rolled and he was killed. Right, he's 19 years old. And in that moment, you just realize that he'll never get married. He'll never have kids. His parents never get to see what he might become. He never gets to meet his nephews. All of that is gone. And I remember I was a Christian at that point for 3 years. And I had believed and understood that my life and the life of God's children are in God's sovereign hands, but I could not reconcile this action and this terrible tragedy, which seems so silly and senseless, with God's goodness and God's care. And at that moment, I learned that suffering brings the question marks into our stories, doesn't it? Those questions that come into our story, it's suffering that writes the question marks. And so I had questions like this. Do you care? Are you seeing any of this? How do I trust a God who has the power to make it stop but doesn't? How do I trust you? Well, I didn't have my questions answered. But what I have subsequently learned is that when I am in the middle of pain and suffering, what I need is faith. And what helps stoke my faith is to look back at God's story where I can have some distance and perspective and I can see how God acted. And I can maybe even look back over my story from maybe chapters back behind me where I have some distance and I have some perspective and I can see how God acted then. That I could see that God always works with a purpose. That God's actions never contradict His love and His goodness. And I'll get back to that in a sec. Charles Spurgeon, who trying to answer the question, why would God wait 400 years and let His people be enslaved for 400 years, said this. He said, in all probability, if the Israelites had been left to themselves, they would have melted and absorbed into the Egyptian race, and they would have lost their identity as God's chosen people. Remember, they settled into Egypt. They were content there. They were quite willing to be Egyptianized. In fact, to a large degree, they began to adopt the superstitions and the idolatries, the iniquities of Egypt, and they clung to those things even years after they were delivered, to such a terrible extent that we can easily imagine how much their hearts must have turned very much towards the sins of Egypt. Yet all the while, God's plan was to bring them out of that place. God promised that they would be strangers in Egypt. And if things had continued to gone well for them in Egypt, you know what? They would have melted like Greenland glaciers into the Egyptian culture. It was the suffering of Pharaoh that not only united them as a people, but kept them at arm's length from the Egyptians. It was the suffering that actually kept them as a people. But suffering did something else. Suffering did something else that suffering can do to you and I. The suffering got them to cry out to God. You see, suffering it's like when we get to suffering, it's like a fork in the road, an unbelievably powerful fork in the road, where because of the questions that come out of suffering, we can turn away from God and we can get angry at Him and we can shake our fist and we can say, forget it. Or suffering becomes the way in which we open ourselves up to God in new ways. Where we invite Him in new ways. Where we say, I'm not in control anymore. I need you. Look at Exodus chapter 2, verse 23. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery. They cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. And God heard their groaning. God remembered His covenant. With Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob, God saw the people of Israel and God knew. The truth is that suffering is often the thing that opens us up to a new work of God. Those same hardships that that right questions and cause us to question God also can drive us to Him. It's usually the bad or the difficult circumstances in our lives that prepare us for a new work of God in our lives. It's in the midst of suffering that we open up and we invite God into our stories. Nobody I know invites God into their finances when everything is going well and the bank account is bulging. You don't do that. But when you've got that meeting and you're sitting in the parking lot outside the bank, you've got that dreaded meeting with the banker, and the collection agencies are nipping at your heels, that's when it's like, oh God, it's Sean, right? You haven't heard from me in a while, but I'm asking, if you're not too busy, you might step into this. You might come. What? Suffering puts us in a posture where we open ourselves up and invite God in. Nobody invites God into their most intimate relationships when everything is going great. So when the relationship is on the skids and conflict is constant, there's talk of separation, that we go and we plead with God. God, I'm welcoming you into this place. I'm welcoming you to come in and to do something, to take over, to change the script, because everything I'm doing is screwing it up. Suffering orients us to God. In our desperation for relief or for change, we're more open to talk to God, listen to God. We're more willing to allow Him to lead us in a new direction. And that's why I look back over my life, and almost every major crossroads, right from me first putting my faith in Jesus to God calling me out of my whole vocational plans that I had for years into ministry, to the times where I grew the most spiritually, all came at a crossroads of suffering and pain. Every single one. Suffering is the soil that seems to produce faith. That's why Peter says this. He says, after you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to His eternal glory in Christ, will Himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. Do you see what he's saying? That strength, establishment, restoration, confirmation, that's the word, confirmation. Confirmation all follows what? Suffering. Pain in our lives is often that variable that God uses to draw us out of our old life, to draw us into the new. And so when my cousin died, it was hard, and I had all kinds of questions, and a lot of those questions haven't been answered. But as I look back now, 20 years on, I look back now, I can see that God's hand was intricately and intimately involved in the details that were going on in my family. That the pain of losing Waylon and the gospel that his parents clung to and his parents proclaimed actually became the thing that drove two of my uncles to bow the knee and accept Christ as Savior. Their life was changed as a result of that loss. It was the thing that drove my aunt and uncle's marriage, which was terrible and falling apart. It was the thing that drove them to God, and they saw in such an unbelievable change and transformation that like people should write a book about it, because their marriage was so... Why? Because that pain opened them up and invited God in. And that's what it does. The scriptures say this, that through all these years that were going on, that God saw His people, that He heard their groaning. Now, if we just pause there, that's actually not very comforting. Right? If we just have a God that sees, He sees everything. He sees everything we've done. He sees every wound you've suffered or every wound you've afflicted. He hears everything that you've said and every curse that you've uttered. He hears and sees it all. That's not all that comforting. But He doesn't stop there. It says that God remembered His covenant and God knew. God knew. Now we can read that word God knew and we just think that maybe it's talking about, the sum total of God's brilliance. That God just knows all the facts and He knows all the details. But that's not what it's trying to say in Hebrew. It's not saying that God is just up to date on everything and God's aware and He's got every memo. That's not what it's saying. It's saying that this word conveys God's deep, personal, intimate knowledge that's fused with compassion that actually drives God to act. That God made a covenant promise with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that he would not forget. He put his name on that promise. He put his credibility on the line with that promise. And so he's going to raise up Moses, who will be the one to lead them to freedom, who will be the one that God uses to draw them out of their physical slavery and their physical suffering. He will be their Redeemer. But God had way bigger plans. He remembers a way better covenant than that one. In Luke chapter 9, we're told that when Jesus was transfigured up on the mountain, right? His disciples he's got a couple of his disciples up there, and they see this like Shazam, the light show comes on, and Jesus is radiating, and some of his glory is coming out, and we're told that two people appeared with him, and it was Moses and it was Elijah. And Luke says this, it'll come up here. And they discussed with Jesus his departure, which he was about to fulfill in Jerusalem. Now that little word, departure, it's a really strange word in the Greek. It's a really hard word to translate because it is a direct translation of the word Exodus. They were talking about Jesus' Exodus that was to come in Jerusalem. That God, so attentive, so moved by what he has seen and what he has heard, so faithful to his covenant, that God would, rather than stay away or just observe our sin and suffering, he would wade into it. You see, suffering not only becomes a point where you often open yourself up to God, but suffering is a place where God meets with you, not in yours alone, but in Jesus's. You see, Jesus was coming into the suffering, and on the cross, by his death, he was taking all of the bite marks of the world. The full teeth of the world was being sunk into his flesh. Why? So that we could be not just liberated from physical slavery or physical bondage, but we could be liberated from physical slavery, physical bondage, and eternal slavery and eternal bondage to sin and death. And so these elements that we're going to take, wherever you are in your suffering, these elements are a reminder that even if you don't know the why behind your pain, you know that God himself has entered into suffering for you. You can know the who. That our God wades into the story, that his own body on a cross becomes the pathway to a new exodus, that God might draw you out of your old life and draw you out of your pain and draw you out of your bondage and your guilt and draw you into his life and his freedom. So let me just ask you this. Close with this. What might happen in these next couple of months if you really understood and really believed that full surrender to Jesus Christ made you free? What would happen to your marriage? What would happen to your finances? What would happen to your work? What would happen to your life right now if what you really believed is that God was after your freedom? If you saw that those things that are hard and painful, whether you're a victim or you're the perpetrator in your own story, those things that are hard and painful are often the potential starting point for a whole new work of God. That the Exodus only begins when we recognize our pain. And it turns question marks into exclamation marks when we recognize his suffering and his pain. May today and in the weeks to come, may you know and may you believe that wherever you have been, whatever your story has consisted of, that God sees and God hears, that God will forever remember his covenant, and God knows you. Let's pray. God, I thank you for your story. And I thank you how looking back and seeing how you worked and seeing your heart and seeing how you narrated and orchestrated stuff and seeing how the things in the world and the things in your people warred against your plans helps us better diagnose our life today. God, none of us are immune to pain and suffering. None of us are immune to the questions that naturally arrive from them. And God, we don't often get answers. But I believe that the point of this table is not just try to answer our suffering, but to remind us that you are with us in our suffering. That suffering never has to be the end of the story. Because you took on suffering and it wasn't the end of your story. That you were resurrected out of pain and death, out of the consequence of sin into new life. And therefore we will be too. I ask God for my friends here who maybe are in a hard place. Might this be the moment that they cry out to you? Might this be the place that they invite you into their marriages, or into their parenting, or into their addiction, or into their shame, or into their guilt, or into their confusion? Might this be the place that they invite you in so that you could lead them out? In Jesus' name, amen.